to start by saying that there is a piece by David Grossman that appeared in the Times today that is more beautiful and important and soulfully true than anything I could possibly say, and I commend it to you. It has been 21 weeks since October 7th. When I think back to those first weeks after the unbelievably horrific assault of that day, I remember being immobilized, continually nauseous, totally devastated, and compromised in my ability to function. I couldn't stop looking at images and reading accounts, even as they sickened me further. I think that was true for many of us. I felt simultaneously glued and crushed, and I felt set apart from the business as usual of the world. And then when it became clear that the bombing of Gaza was unbelievably disproportionate and lethal, when reports emerged about families losing 10 or 20 people each, children, innocents, when images emerged of flattened regions and wastelands, again I was nauseous and devastated and compromised and glued and crushed. And it was around then that the reports came out about the sexual violence against Israeli women. And I remember in November and December walking through the world, watching the business as usual around me, and aware that other people, somebody out there was not as close to this catastrophe as I was, and they had the liberty to live their lives basically unmolested by the images and the stories, and just feeling so apart from that. Now, 21 weeks after October 7th, as we enter the month of March, many of us have gone back to focusing on the business as usual of the world. Our jobs, our child rearing, our errands, our activities, our projects. Maybe you saw the op-ed last Sunday in the Times by Tali Sharot and Cass Sunstein, a neuroscientist and law professor, about habituation. The fact that the human brain is wired to accustom itself to everything in our environment that is gradual or ongoing. They cite that experiments that prove that human beings habituate to that which repeats or persists, including gross dishonesty, corruption, immorality, oppression, including horror. And when something that was once unacceptable becomes normal, we are ready to habituate to something worse. This is my 16th sermon about the war. And people have been asking me, when am I going to start speaking about something else? But there are still 130 hostages somewhere under or in Gaza, undergoing who knows what torture. And there are still 1.5 million Palestinian people in Rafah without sanitation or food or clean water or medical care or housing, on the edge of starvation and disease, being bombed and in danger of tanks rolling in any day. Most of whom fled there from their homes elsewhere in Gaza on Israeli orders. And yesterday, as we probably all know, in northern Gaza, it seems that Israeli tanks opened fire on starving people who were trying to get food that was being thrown off of the back of trucks in aid convoys. More than 100 people died, we think, and 700 were injured. Now, the IDF says that what mostly happened is that people were trampled to death, and maybe many were. But you can see in drone footage people ducking for cover, and you can hear gunfire in video footage. The editorial team at Haaretz is calling for a full investigation and argues that, quote, even before the details of what happened have been fully clarified. These unnecessary deaths highlight the anarchy that Israel's partial occupation of Gaza has created in the absence of any civil authority that would see to the residents' needs and enable them to return to their destroyed towns and villages. Consequently, the editorial team continues, the time has come to halt the offensive operations in Gaza. Instead, Israel must try as quickly as possible to finalize the proposed deal with Hamas, a lengthy ceasefire, and the release of the Palestinians imprisoned in Israel in exchange for the return of the Israeli hostages held by Hamas. Before Gaza turns into Somalia, the Haaretz editors conclude, it is time now to stop. As many of you know, in the weeks after October 7th, I fully supported Israel's right to defend itself and to seek to both bring back the hostages and to dismantle Hamas. As it became clear that Israel's bombing campaign was disproportionately killing innocent civilians, I called again and again from our bimas for restraint, for precision, for an end to all indiscriminate killing. In December, as it became clear that Israel could not defeat Hamas through a ground war and Palestinian casualties were astronomical, I called for an immediate negotiated hostage release and end to the war. I still believe that Hamas must be defeated, but not this way. And now the call for a bilateral ceasefire with hostage and prisoner release has never been more urgent. As they approach their 150th day in captivity, every passing day means more danger for Israeli hostages, more dead soldiers, and more senseless tragedy for Palestinians. What happened yesterday must not happen again. The tanks have to come out of Gaza. The hostages must come home. Gaza needs a non-Israeli civil administration that can care for its people. People there need food, and they need water, and they need healthcare, and they need toilets, and they need to be able to go home and rebuild. Continued war and Israeli occupation of Gaza will be an unmitigated disaster. Dalia Scheindlin, an Israeli political analyst and public opinion expert in Tel Aviv, wrote an op-ed in the Times this week in which she pointed to the illusions that Israelis have become habituated to through Netanyahu's promise that they can, quote, have it all. His claim since October 7th is that the military campaign can both destroy Hamas and bring their loved ones home. It is not possible to have both. And this is only the latest, Scheindlin writes, in sets of, quote, logically irreconcilable pairs that Israelis have clung to for decades. For example, the idea that Israel can permanently occupy Palestinian areas and remain a Jewish state with a Jewish majority is an irreconcilable pair. The idea that Israel can be an occupying power and still be a democracy is an irreconcilable pair. And Scheindlin writes, quote, the most violent myth of all holds that Israel can stifle Palestinian freedom forever while living in peace. She conducted a poll last summer in which a stunning 88% of Jewish Israelis aged 15 to 21, these are young people, agreed with the statement, Israel can be a democratic state even though it controls Palestinian areas where Palestinians cannot vote in Israeli elections. Netanyahu, like Trump, knows that when you repeat lies often enough, people believe them. People can be habituated to anything. Scheindlin says, after October 7th, the falsehood that Israel can have it all regarding security has been exposed. It is not possible to suffocate and sideline Palestinian self-determination, to bask in regional normalization, and also to live with a reasonable level of peace. And yet many Israelis are reaching the opposite conclusion. Even before the war, surveys showed that just a minority of Israelis supported a two-state solution, she says. And during the war, that portion has declined further. I have spoken many times since October 7th of false binaries. Having to choose between being pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian is a false binary. There are two peoples living in the land. There are two peoples with real legitimate history there. There are two peoples who deserve freedom and self-determination and safety. The only moral position is to be both pro-Israeli and pro-Palestinian, even as we loudly and clearly protest their governments. But just as there are false binaries, there are also false pairings. As Scheindlin said, occupation of Palestinians and a Jewish state with a Jewish majority are a false pairing. They don't go together. Occupation and democracy are a false pairing. They don't go together. You can't run a society with two separate sets of laws for two populations, deny one of those populations the vote, and call yourself a democracy. And eventually, the anti-democratic laws and practices to which the society habituates itself through occupation end up leading to things like judicial reform. It is either occupation or democracy. There are real choices to be made. In our parasha, Tisa, we see a stark choice between the Mishkan and the golden calf. Moses is up on Mount Sinai receiving instructions from God for the construction of the tabernacle, or the Mishkan, the meeting place between the people and God, when, quote, Vayar ha'am ki voshesh Moshe laredet min hahar. When the people saw or feared that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered against Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who shall go before us. For that fellow Moses, the man who brought us out from the land of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." Vayikach mi'adam, vayatzar oto, bacheret, v'ya'asehu, egel masecha. Vayomru, ele Elohecha Yisrael, asher he'elucha me'eretz Mitzrayim. He took their golden earrings from them and cast them in a mold and made it into a molten calf. And they exclaimed, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Medieval commentator Chizkuni says the whole people at this point were being tested as to their sincere belief in a God who is and remains unseen and devoid of tangible dimensions. This week, Rabbi Colin helped me see that the choice between the calf and the Mishkan is like choices that we have to make in our world now. The calf is a simple, shiny object. It is tangible, it is solid, it is easy to make, it is reassuring. The people made it because they were afraid, because they wanted something to protect them and save them. But the calf cannot protect them or save them. On the other hand, the Mishkan is not simple or shiny, but it is textured and complex. It is difficult to make, but everyone is invited to participate. It is not solid, but it has empty space at the center, and that empty space is dedicated to a God that is invisible and intangible, a God that stands for truth, justice, freedom, and peace. And unlike the calf, which is too heavy to move, the Mishkan is designed to be moved, to accompany the people on their journey, to keep freedom and justice and peace in their midst, to stay with them and guide them as they find their way. Naturally, because the people are terribly afraid, at first they choose the calf. It's the easier choice because it's solid and it's tangible and it seems more real and it seems like it will protect and save them. But it is a false idol. And when they realize that it is a false idol, they turn to building the Mishkan, the more complex answer that has at its center the intangible, the unknown. It is less reassuring, but it is the only thing that might save and protect them. Like our ancestors once were, Israelis are now terribly afraid. I spoke to an Israeli this week who said, "We are not in post-traumatic stress. We are currently in trauma." No wonder most Israelis support continuing the war in Gaza indefinitely. Like a golden calf, this war and ongoing occupation is tangible. It has shiny weapons and brave soldiers, and it seems like it will save and protect Israel, but it will not. As military experts have warned, destroying Hamas through the ground war is impossible. It is a false idol. It is a golden calf. It will only lead to more pain, more destruction, and more death. It will only lead to the death of the hostages. And so I pray that, like our ancestors before us, Israelis will quickly see that they must turn from the calf to the Mishkan, from ongoing war and occupation to the more complex project that might actually protect and save us. bilateral ceasefire with hostage return and prisoner release, a demilitarized Palestinian administration, regional recognition and normalization, and ultimately 2 democratic states. Netanyahu is clearly desiring to choose the golden calf of ongoing war and occupation over the Mishkan of democracy. But as American Jews, we must not let him sacrifice American democracy to that false idol as well. Our president is suffering for his loyalty to Israel, in part because he thinks we want this war. American Jews must make clear that we do not support this ongoing war and occupation, and we do support our government using all of its influence and power to get humanitarian aid in and the hostages and the tanks out, and a path toward regional stability and democracy. Please join me this Sunday in Washington Square Park at 4 p.m. with Israelis for Peace NYC as we call for immediate bilateral ceasefire. Perhaps it is Union Square Park. That's the kind of thing I do, make mistakes like that. This is also the very end in the climax of the whole drash, so thank you for that correction. We're just gonna, it's somewhere in Manhattan. It's in the advisory. Please join me this Sunday as we call for immediate bilateral ceasefire. The hostages have to be the priority, and the war must end now. Shabbat Shalom.